Well, I'm Susan Welch, the Dean of Liberal Arts, and I'm delighted to be the one to introduce our speaker today in this inaugural Malvin and Leah Bank Outstanding Teaching Award winner lecture. But before doing so, I want to tell you a little bit about Mal and Leah Bank and why they established this award. And I'd like to thank them because even though they're not here, we are videotaping this and they'll be able to see it at a later date. So I'd like to thank them for their great generosity and foresight in establishing this award. Mal Bank is a 1952 Penn State graduate with a degree in arts and letters with honors. After graduating from Penn State and serving in the Korean War, he graduated from Yale Law School and then joined Thompson Hine law firm in Cleveland, where he had a distinguished career specializing in taxes and estate planning. Mal also made a mark in his community and beyond by his service on dozens of boards of corporations, universities, community groups, and hospitals. His wife, Leah, earned an Associate Arts and Sciences degree from Penn State, raised 4 sons, and served as a volunteer in her community and her synagogue. During his time at Penn State, Mal was particularly moved by the wonderful teaching of Kent Forrester. And Mal has told me he took every course Kent offered, not because he had a particular a priori interest in the topic, but because Kent Forrester was such a wonderful and inspiring teacher. Mal was very inspired throughout his college career by Kent Forrester and really gives him a lot of credit for making his Penn State education what it was. And I can say parenthetically that this view is held by many others of our alums, and some of them have established a Kent Forrester Award in history. But by establishing this teaching award, Mal and Leah want to encourage other liberal arts faculty to be great teachers. As part of the award, the winning faculty member is to give a public lecture on teaching. And so I'm delighted then to be able to introduce our first Malvin and Leah Bank Outstanding Teaching winner, Eric Silver. So Eric, as many of you know, is a professor of history and criminology who is known for his outstanding teaching and scholarship. He's been a faculty member at Penn State since 1999 and teaches classes both large and small in areas such as deviant behavior. He's particularly well known for his upper level course, which regularly enrolls upwards of 150 students. Now, great teachers do not follow one particular model, but they are linked by their passion for their subject matter and for teaching. And Eric is certainly passionate about student learning and uses a variety of techniques to help his students learn, from Facebook and other social media to lectures and class discussions. Through his teaching, Eric hopes that students will learn to think sociologically about the world and continue to do so as their lives move beyond Happy Valley. Eric has also been an active mentor to many undergraduates and employs a number of them over the years as undergraduate teaching assistants. For several years, he served as associate head of the Department of Sociology, and in that role developed a teaching forum with invited speakers sharing their best practices with teachers in the department. And he also mentored several of his colleagues who wanted to improve their teaching. So he certainly has many qualifications to be this first Mal and Leah Bank Award winner. He's going to speak to us today on elephants in the classroom, how I talk about difficult topics, and why. So, Eric?
Thank you, Susan. And thank you all for being here today. I have notes. Mostly it's so that this talk doesn't take 90 minutes, but only takes more like a half hour to 40 minutes, because without my notes, I'll go off on many tangents. So again, thank you. I believe that to teach students well, you have to meet them where they are. And so at the end of each semester, I ask my students a question that they write about. And the question is, what was the most useful or important thing you learned in this class? And over the years, some themes have emerged. And today, what I want to do is share with you 3 ideas that my students say have been important or useful to them. Okay, so I'm going to share with you what they think they're getting out of my class. But first, a warning. To meet students where they are, I use edgy, attention-grabbing material. And so today's talk is going to be a bit edgy, probably, for the Foster Auditorium. And yes, it will have something to do with elephants before it's all done. So my goals as a teacher are captured in 2 quotes. The first quote is, "The mind is not a vessel to be filled, but a fire to be lit." This quote is etched in the ceiling right outside of the Dean's Suite in the Sparks building. Look up and you'll see it there. This quote reminds me that teaching is more than about simply transmitting facts and figures and information. It's about lighting a fire of curiosity so that students want to think and learn on their own. The second quote is from Dostoevsky. And this quote is, "While nothing is easier than to denounce the evildoer, nothing is more difficult than to understand him." This quote reminds me which fire I'm trying to light. See, I want students to burn with curiosity toward the unfamiliar and toward that which they are initially inclined to reject or fear or judge. So now, before giving you an example of how I try to do this in my class, let me first define for you the subject matter that I'm teaching. So I teach a class, it's large, it's called the Sociology of Deviance. Downside of having notes. Sociology of Deviance, and the class has about 170 students in it per semester, and it's as many as the current room will hold. The topics that I cover in the class include alien abduction, pornography, white supremacy, adult-child sexual contact, obesity, suicide bombing, the list goes on. And students also bring topics as well. Now, the definition that we use in class of deviance is behaviors, beliefs, physical characteristics, or feelings that violate a social rule or norm and are likely to elicit negative, condemnatory reactions, what we call judgments, from others. In other words, I'm focusing on things in class that people say, feel, or do that other people don't like. And for me, that's where I want to bring sociology and where I want to excite a sociological insight, is around those kinds of topics. So why extreme topics? Why do I focus on extreme topics? Because I believe that if students can learn to walk an inch in the shoes of a suicide bomber or a white supremacist, they can learn to walk miles in the shoes of, and these are real examples from my students' writing, the dad who was arrested for having child pornography on his computer, the brother who was convicted of statutory rape, the mom who was arrested for stealing prescription drugs from a pharmacy after becoming addicted to them while being treated for breast cancer, the parents who divorced after the father was found having an affair, and the sister who moved to California to become a paid escort. These are all real examples from our students' writing. Okay? This is what some of them are bringing into the room when they come to our classes. Which reminds me always that there are many fractured relationships in this world. And ultimately, in addition to becoming good sociologists, I'd like my students to become healers. Healers in their own lives and healers out in the world. And so laced within my teaching is that idea, that vision, and that aspiration. So now, for a taste of my teaching, I'm going to focus on the topic of suicide bombing. It was actually maybe the least charged I can think of for this. In the in our post 9/11 world, this is clearly a topic that that is intense for many of us. But I really could be focusing on any of the topics that I just mentioned. Keep that in mind. So in the opening scene of the Star Trek movie from a few years ago, a starship is attacked. It's attacked by a huge enemy vessel. And it's clear that the starship is going to be destroyed. The captain orders the crew to evacuate, including his pregnant wife, who is also part of the crew. His plan is to evacuate himself last after putting the ship on autopilot so that it can collide with the enemy vessel and destroy this larger enemy vessel. It's a great plan until the autopilot is knocked out. So what does the captain do? Does he evacuate with the others? No. He decides to stay put and steer the starship into the enemy vessel and destroy it, and himself along with it, in order to buy more time for the evacuation and to help save the lives of his family and his crew. Now, after showing this opening scene of the movie in class, which I didn't do here because we really don't have time for it, I asked this question. Is the captain psychologically disturbed? I mean, he just committed suicide, right? Just voluntarily killed himself. Is he a hero? This is clearly the director's intent, is for us to interpret this as a heroic act. We could also ask, is he a suicide bomber? Is he a suicide bomber? When I ask this question in class, it's just not a hand-raising moment. I'm not looking for the answer. I want folks in the class to just think about it, just to sort of sit with that question, sit with that perspective shift. And if you're like many, your mind wants to argue with this comparison. Right? For many people, this is not a comfortable comparison to make. It wants to take a position. It wants to maybe resist the implications of calling that act of suicide bombing. And this is where the elephant comes in. It's, from my students' perspective, the single most important or useful or memorable idea that they get out of the class. To teach college-age students to become more aware of their judgments, the judgments that prevent them from being able to take multiple perspectives in trying to understand something, including the deviant's perspective, I use the metaphor of an elephant and a rider. The elephant represents our judgments, our stereotypes, our moral outrage, our disgust. It brings with it an overpowering urge to correct or defend. And the thing that is important about this as a metaphor and why I use the elephant is that, first of all, these reactions are automatic. But more than that, they're powerful. They're powerful and they're all-encompassing. And if you can imagine sitting on top of an elephant, when that elephant wants to go right, this is no way you're stopping it from moving. And for many of us, we are sitting atop elephants that are moving us left and right in response to all kinds of issues. And we're barely aware of the process. As adults, hopefully we become more aware of this. But for students, when they're 20 years old, not really, not quite yet. The rider represents our curiosity, our openness to learning, and our willingness to understand new perspectives. Okay? It takes practice to find the rider. This is a big part of the beginning of my class, is to make this point and to understand it. It takes practice. It's not an easy thing to do. So what I do in my classes, I use extreme topics to intentionally provoke students' elephants. The topics get more and more intense as we go, and each time we practice becoming the rider. Every so often, I think I go a little too far, and there's something that feels like an elephant stampede, breaks out in the room, and there's a buzz and a murmur, and it's sometimes difficult to bring it back into a space where we can, rejoin each other. But by practicing this and by learning to settle our elephants and allowing our rider to take command, we're able to have a chance to see from different perspectives issues and situations that we are initially inclined to reject or fear or judge. So the elephant and rider is the first idea. It links to the second most memorable idea from my class, according to my students, which is the 3 ways of looking at the world. The first way we call in class a correctional approach. Okay? Correctional approach. This is the most common approach. Here we encounter something different. We encounter the other, the deviant, whatever you want to call it. And we have this urge to eliminate, to punish, or to judge. Right? This is the most common reaction we have. It's also the approach that's most common in research on criminology and deviance, where our goal is to study a phenomenon in order to eliminate, punish, judge, control, whatever it is. That's the orientation that's most common. And it's certainly the stance we take when the topic of suicide bombing is brought into our attention. The other approach is an advocacy approach. And here we're inclined, sometimes automatically, because of that elephant, to promote, defend, or excuse when confronted with a topic. And now, for most people, and especially for most 20-year-olds, these are the only 2 options. Right? Inconceivable that there's anything other than taking sides in an issue, anything other than correcting or being an advocate. So to prepare students for the topics that we're going to cover in class, what I do is I aim us toward a third option, something that exists right between. You know, if you make a point right there between correcting and defending, that's what I'm aiming at. And in class, we call this a naturalistic approach. And the goal of a naturalistic approach is simply to understand what is, to understand what's going on. And the key to understanding what's going on, the key to gaining insight into what is going on in a system, in a social system, is to see it from as many perspectives as possible. And most importantly, from the perspective that you are least inclined to see it from. Right? Because that's where the block is. That's where the blinder is. That's the blinder that we need to lift in order to gain insight. So I use the term naturalistic very, very intentionally here, because what I want to encourage us to do is to see human behavior like we see behavior in nature. For example, we don't judge the leopard for chasing down and attacking and killing the antelope. You know, if we did, we'd have a hard time learning about the system that connects those 2 things, right? The ecosystem and the ways in which their behaviors relate to one another. I want us to look at the social world in the same way. I want us to, for a moment, suspend judgment, neither correct nor advocate, in order to open up a space. And in that space, and even if that space opens up for only 30 seconds, which for some people I think is all I get in a whole semester, but in those 30 seconds, something new can come in, right? New learning, new insight, something new can come in. And that's where we're aiming all the time. We're aiming for that space. What I tell my students over and over again is that elephants don't learn, only riders learn. Because as long as you're in one of the correcting or advocacy stances, you're not learning, you're rehearsing your own ideas, your own judgments. There's not a true learning going on. I also say, and this is more of a challenge or a question, that I think it's impossible to judge something and learn about it at the same time. I repeat that over and over, and I tell students, go home, try and do it. Tell me how that goes, Judge it and learn about it at the same time, just to see what happens. The other thing that I have to say over and over, because it can be uncomfortable to learn about deviant things from the deviant's perspective, is that understanding is not agreeing. Understanding is not agreeing. I don't care whether a student agrees with a particular idea or point of view. Another way of saying it, it sounds maybe kind of, mean-spirited. I tell students, I don't care what you think. Because I don't care what you think. I care that you think. Right? That's what it's about. But I don't care what you think in the end. And if you're going to agree or disagree with something, ultimately, doesn't it make a lot of sense to first understand it? get the cart in the right place in relation to the horse. Now, this is hard. It's hard for all of us. It's hard for me. In this case, in this sense, I don't claim to be a master at this, and I often begin a class by acknowledging that. Now, remember, I'm not a master at this. I'm pointing towards something that I think we can try and attain. In that sense, the teaching transcends the teacher, right? And I think the best teaching transcends the teacher. I think we have to be careful as teachers not to present ourselves as enlightened beings embodying some higher teaching, right? I mean, unless we're trying to create a cult and start a new religion, we really have to be careful about that line and keep the humility there and realize that the things we teach, we often have not mastered, and that's fine, right? That's a teacher is a pointer. The teacher is a pointer, and I'm happy to be pointing towards something that I too am striving to do in my own life. And in fact, the class is organized in such a way that the students will get to see me try and do it in front of them in real time, topic by topic, guest speaker by guest speaker. So it's a thing, it's a living thing. So with these ideas in mind, let me turn briefly to suicide bombing. Before each class, I ask students questions related to the topics. Usually they're using poll everywhere, so I say phones out, which is something they don't often hear in classes, but I want the phones out. I want them texting in their answers. They get to see them up on the screen. And the question that I ask before the suicide bombing unit is to agree or disagree. Most suicide bombers probably have something wrong with them psychologically. And it turns out that I've asked this question now to over 700 students over the past several years, and we get about 49% agree. Okay? I'd probably bet there's slightly fewer than that, lower percent in this room, but still, it's an idea out there. Now, whether or not you agree that suicide bombers have something wrong with them psychologically, or think of some group that you do think has something wrong with them psychologically. Maybe they're members of the Tea Party, or maybe they're, very liberal Democrats. I don't know, whatever they are for you, right? That's the point, is to go there. Think about what happens to our motivation to understand that other's perspective, that deviant's perspective, when we think it's irrational or disturbed. What happens to our motivation to understand? If something's irrational or disturbed, doesn't that mean that it can't be understood? Right? Isn't that what's going on there? We call it that, and now we have a good reason not to try. Our curiosity is diminished in direct proportion to our belief that something or someone is being or acting or fundamentally irrational or disturbed. So what does the research say? The best single book that I have found on this topic of suicide bombing is called Manufacturing Human Bombs, published in 2006. And it studied the campaign of suicide attacks that took place in the Second Palestinian Uprising, known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada, which began in September 2000. One of the findings from the book is captured here. The author, whose name is Hafez, the author says, what was particularly striking about the population of incarcerated Middle Eastern terrorists my research team interviewed in Israeli and Palestinian prisons was their apparent normality. Their apparent normality. They went looking for the crazy terrorist and couldn't find him or her. And so, we can ask ourselves, how can this be, right? How could it be that that's not the case? And if you're like many, this statement, can stir the elephant a little bit. I don't know. How can they not be crazy? Why would anybody do that? They're hurting innocent people. They're killing themselves. It just doesn't make any sense. And it's in moments like these, whether it's this topic again or another topic that causes that effect, when we encounter information that contradicts what we believe, right? This is when I believe we've got to find that rider. We've got to get into that curious openness to a different perspective place. And it's not an easy thing to do. So if suicide bombers are not mentally deranged, how can we understand their willingness or indeed eagerness to pursue this path? This is the question that we ask in class. Well, in the same study, interviews were conducted, and one of the interview questions was, how can you commit suicide terrorism in the name of Allah when the Quran specifically forbids suicide? Right? When we're against something, we love to get people in gotcha moments, right? Ha, you're a hypocrite. Right? And so here you have that kind of question. And the answer here, the captured suicide bomber said, this is not suicide. Suicide's weak. It's selfish. It's mentally disturbed. That's pretty cool. The suicide bomber is in the 49% who think suicide bombing is mentally disturbed. You gotta love that. He said, it's neither of those things. It's istishad. It's istishad. So we gotta say, well, what's that? What's istishad? Istishad is martyrdom. Right? It has a whole different feel, that word. Puts you in a whole different space. We all know that a martyr is a person who acts on behalf of others, and by doing so, endures great suffering or even death. So much hinges on whether we interpret this behavior as suicide or as martyrdom. Right? So much hinges. Martyrdom is the insider's view. It's how it looks to them. Right? And to them, this is heroic. Right? This is an act of heroism. Suicide, which is the West's word for this kind of behavior, that's the outsider's view. And of course it looks weak and deranged and all kinds of things. So many of you have probably heard this story in the news because it was from last month. It's about 96-year-old Nicholas Oresco. He was the oldest surviving Medal of Honor recipient until he passed away last month, which is why his story was in the news. And here he's posing with the youngest Medal of Honor recipient, and that's Dakota Meyer. Referring to the day during World War II when Nicholas did the deed that won him this medal, he says that our job was to take out 2 machine gun nests on the side of a hill. We couldn't see them, but they saw us. Now the story here is that after 2 costly attempts, his men refused to attack again. Okay, so he's in a platoon. He's saying, we're not done. The nests are still there. And they're like, no, we're not going. We're not going. So what does he do? He attacks these 2 machine gun nests by himself. You're not going? It's our duty. We got to do this. I'm doing it without you. He didn't expect to survive. He says, quote, I looked up at the sky and I said, Lord, I know I'm going to die. Let's just make it fast. Then, using a hand grenade, he charges up the hill, takes out one of the machine gun nests. He's wounded during that single attack. He keeps going, charges further up the hill, hurls another hand grenade, takes out the second nest. And so we can ask, are Medal of Honor winners heroes, or are they suicidal soldiers? Right? Is that what that is? You got to be a little suicidal. Now, I give homework assignments each week, and they are aimed at practicing this kind of flipped perspective. You notice that's what I'm doing here. I'm flipping things. And so each homework assignment is designed to practice this flip perspective. In one assignment, I asked students, under what conditions can you imagine yourself killing another human being? Now, many find this assignment disturbing because I ask them to be as detailed as possible. I want details, you know. well, not all of them find it disturbing because I've got vets in the class, right? I've got ROTC students. These students have no problem with this question. They've given this a lot of thought. And they come up with outstanding answers and really, really thoughtful answers. They mention things like chain of command and hostage scenarios and civilian collaboration. I mean, they've got this thing really worked out. But most don't, okay? The answer, if you see hundreds of these, we all know when we're looking at our students' work, is themes start to emerge. So here's one that's very representative. I would take another person's life because of a desperate situation, such as protecting my family or my country. Killing someone can be necessary, but only to prevent a greater evil. I don't believe that killing is okay unless it is in protection. Okay, so now let's flip the perspective like I do in my class. Here's a summary of research on suicide bombers. Most suicide bombers, it turns out, have had a loved one killed or severely harmed by their enemy. Others seek to avenge harm done to their ethnic, cultural, or religious group. In other words, the same kinds of things that students talk about when they imagine themselves killing, the things that would lead them to kill, are part of the reality of people who are motivated to kill and to do it in an extreme way. And so the point is that we can understand their perspective. We can start to understand their perspective, but we've got to start to imagine ourselves in their situation. We've got to shift that perspective. That's the key. We've got to flip the perspective to see it from their side, and the more we do that, the more the larger sociological picture can come into focus, right? The more we can see the situation from the multiple vantage points. Okay, so remember the first two ideas that I mentioned are the elephant and the rider metaphor. The naturalistic perspective was the second idea. The third and final thing that my students say they find useful is this question that gets repeated throughout the semester. It's my way of evoking the rider, in key moments. Okay, so is my own perspective in perspective? That's the question. This is an important question to me because this is what I think of as critical thinking. We all know, in higher education, there's much talk about critical thinking. Every teaching philosophy you ever read, and I've read many, I know many in this room have, critical thinking is one of the goals. It's almost, you just have to have it in there. But we often have a very simple view of critical thinking. And so I want to say that I believe that critical thinking is more than being critical of other people's thinking. Right? That's not all that critical thinking is about. Somebody says something, you kind of cross your arms and go, nah, not really buying it. That's not that's not critical thinking, okay? And yet, so much of how we talk about critical thinking has that sort of very simple attitude about it. I would consider that the elementary school version of critical thinking. I think the more advanced version of critical thinking is when we become capable of being critical of our own thinking. That's where critical thinking really takes off. Because in that moment, that my own perspective becomes in perspective, in other words, that I glimpse that I'm bringing a perspective to something, in that moment, new thoughts and new insights are possible. And that's the whole point of critical thinking, is to gain new thoughts, new insights into a situation or a problem. So one way to keep our own perspectives in perspective is to recognize that my way of judging, my elephant, if you will, is only one of many. To illustrate this in class, I draw on cutting-edge research in moral psychology. I'm a sociologist, my class is about sociology, but I'll steal a good idea from any discipline. I'm totally soulless when it comes to that. And what's going on in moral psychology and articles published in Science and other journals, there's really some exciting stuff here. What they're finding is that our judgments are rooted in a series of discernible moral foundations. That's what they call them, moral foundations. So let me just click through the 5 moral foundations that these moral psychologists have been discovering in their research. Care is one. Situations in where we perceive someone being harmed tend to elicit a moral reaction in many people. Some more than others, so these are variables, and I'll get to that in a minute. But care is a foundation that's important. They also find that justice or violations of equal treatment for many elicit a moral reaction, a moral response, get that elephant on the move. Again, people differ in how much inequality will trigger that response. Violations of authority are another moral trigger. Some of us are raised to respect authority, whether it's parents or the police officer or dean. And violations of that, if we were to witness, even see violations of that, for many of us will cause a gut reaction, a moral reaction, right? Something's been violated. Loyalty is another. Many of us believe that it's important to be loyal to our spouses, our partners, our employers, our families, our platoons, or whatever. And again, violations that we see will elicit reactions. And the fifth one that the moral psychologists have discovered, and as a set, is violations of purity. And this one is more religious in nature. So this is norms that govern how we ought to take care of our bodies, treat our bodies, or the foods we ought to eat. Those of you who are heavily into eating organic probably score high on the purity foundation. There's this sense that, I don't want that yucky stuff in me. So the idea is that our moral reactions, our judgments, derive from these foundations. Much like we have taste buds, 5 taste buds to discern taste, we have these moral foundations, things that, ways in which we are pre-wired to respond to things. Of course, our culture teaches us what exactly to map onto these foundations, and so cultures differ. And also individuals differ within cultures because we're all raised slightly differently, and so we'll have a different sense here. Now, the top two are about a concern with individual harm, mostly. People being harmed, people being treated unequally. The bottom two, and here's where some sociology comes into it, these have to do with a concern about groups, about the strength of group traditions or the stability of groups. If we don't have respect for authority, if we're not loyal, and if we don't observe and respect our group's practices, our groups are weaker. Right? So our moral foundations help us do this balancing act between, as a group now, not each individual, but collectively we do this balancing act between protecting the individual and their interests and balancing those interests against the interests of the group. And they're all going on in this cluster of foundations. Okay, so the key point for my students and for myself is that what this means is that there are simply different ways of being moral, and that good, well-meaning people can differ in their moral responses to the same situations because they're bringing to those situations a different configuration of moral foundations. And this, I believe, is a challenge to us as teachers. I think it's a challenge to us as teachers, especially in liberal arts, where the topics that we cover are often morally charged. Right? Not just sociology. You're teaching poetry, and you're going to get people riled at some point. And so it's important because it tells us that there are these different reactions out there. And I think our job is to try and reach all of our students. Okay? And to reach all of our students, we've got to acknowledge and even honor the different ways of perceiving what's right and wrong that's in our room, in our classroom. So we've got to be aware of our own perspective. Right? As teachers, we've got to keep our perspective in perspective in order not to alienate those students who don't share our point of view. And maybe that sounds trite, but I could tell you as someone who served as associate head and dealt with a lot of teaching issues, it's not. Right? That's a real issue and something we all really need to be, I think, mindful of. Okay, so now let's take a look at our own students. Last fall, Stacy Silver, who's sitting in the front row, is my wife and colleague, and graduate student Leslie Abel and I surveyed 1,374 students, and we asked them about their moral foundations. The moral psychologists I was mentioning earlier, they've come up with validated scales, so you can measure these 5 moral foundations. We also asked them about their political leanings, right? Liberal, moderate, and conservative. And it turns out that among our students, at least among this group of over 1,300, it's not normal. It tilts toward liberal, but there's a good spread of the spectrum going on there in the groups. And so, just raise your hand if you consider yourself a liberal. Okay, I see a lot of hands. Raise your hand if you consider yourself conservative. You got 1. That's a lot for liberal arts, actually. So, so I think it's important because, if we all share a view, especially we teachers all share a view, heading into a classroom where there's a diversity of views, there's something we need to be aware of there. So what I'm going to show you are how our students break out. The blue bars that I'm going to show you combine the care and justice scores. The reason I combine them is because they factor analyze together, they're highly correlated, and so I group them together. The red bars are going to be the authority, loyalty, and purity scores. Those group-oriented ones tend to cluster together. The individual-oriented ones tend to cluster together. And what you can see is that as you move from liberal to conservative, the concern with care and justice goes down. Liberals are highly concerned about harm to individuals and inequality, unfair treatment. Right? That's what defines a lot of what liberals respond to. And then as we get more conservative, the scores that reflect those care and justice feelings start to come down. So liberals say, aha, I knew it. Those conservatives, they just don't care about people. Right? Well, you could look at it that way. But the story is a little more complicated than that, and I think more interesting. Because if you look at, as we move from liberal to conservative, the concerns with authority, loyalty, and purity, they go up. Okay? They go up. So depending on how students break out with their political orientation, they're bringing a different configuration of moral concerns, moral foundations to the classroom, to our topics. Right? And the question, I think, and the challenge for us is, can we encompass them all? Right? Can we speak to them all? The other thing I'll point out here is that notice the conservatives, when you get to the most conservative category, they're about equal. Right? What's happening here with conservatives is that they have a wider spectrum of moral concerns. They have the individual and they have the group. And if you've noticed, watching the news or maybe talking to people, conservatives are easier to fluster on moral issues than are liberals. Give a liberal a moral dilemma, they'll basically say, well, is anybody being hurt? Nope, well, I'm good. Right? I may not actually agree. I'll say, well, I wouldn't do it, but live and let live. That's a liberal kind of way. No one's being hurt. It's fine with me. Even though I prefer you not do it right in front of me. Whereas the conservative has easier to fluster because there's more moral concerns coming to the fore to balance. Right? It could take them longer to process a situation that you're presenting a student who's conservative. It can take longer to process that situation because more will be stirred, more will be competing for their attention within themselves in that moment. And I just think these are important things for us to keep in mind. Okay, so I want to conclude with some words from my students. Last week, my grad student, Leslie, or maybe it was a couple of weeks ago now, I asked her to comb through last semester's answers to that question about what you find most useful or important about the class, and to find some representative answers. And what I'm going to show you now these aren't cherry-picked. I asked her to look for representative ones, and I'm not trying to pat myself on the back when I show you these things. I'd rather trying to give you a sense or a feel for what our students find useful and important, at least from my experience. So the first one is, I have lived the life of letting the elephant trample over my rider. from Melissa. From Mizune, before this class, when I would see something out of the norm, my elephant would run wild, and as the rider, I would have no control at all. And then Stephen, even in situations where I find myself judging and letting my elephant run loose, I now notice that I'm doing it. Right? To me, that's really important. I now notice that I'm doing it. Whereas before, I think I would just judge someone and not think twice about it. So I want to read one more. It's a little longer than these, but it captures so much in it, and quite honestly, it reminds me of why I do this kind of work. This one is from Michelle. Of my 4 years in college, I truly believe that this sociology class was one of the most valuable classes I've taken. Not only did I learn a great deal about deviance, but I also learned to change my own thoughts and reactions to different scenarios. I've been truly shocked, interested, and extremely disturbed at certain points, but overall have definitely benefited from each class session. Each week, I felt like I was taking away more and more from the experience. The most important thing I've taken away from this class is the ability to look at situations naturalistically. This is important to me because I feel like it's a very essential skill to have going into the real world. As a graduating senior about to enter the workforce, I'm going to be meeting new people and getting myself into new situations, and it's imperative that I'm able to look at situations naturalistically and learn about people before I react. Before this class, I was very judgmental and extremely quick to jump to conclusions. This class has taught me to stop and learn the facts, as well as delve into other people's perspectives and backgrounds, and to think before I judge. This skill will prove beneficial to me in the next chapter of my life. So in conclusion, as you can see, teaching for me is more than about transmitting facts and figures. It's about lighting a fire of curiosity, and especially toward that which we're inclined to judge or reject or fear. In the end, I believe students learn most not from what we professors say, but from what they think and they write and they talk about in response to what we say. And I believe that it's whether that's on a call home to their parents or talking to their friends in the dorm or at the bar, right? I'm fine with students going to the bar as long as while they're there they're talking about my class. So it's all good with me. So if my class does little more than provide fodder for a good dorm room conversation or a conversation with parents, then I'm happy. If it leads a student to open his or her mind to someone in their lives whose behavior they find troubling, well, then I'm ecstatic. So I want to thank you all for your time and attention. I'd especially like to thank Mal and Leah Bank for their generous support of teaching in the College of the Liberal Arts. I also want to thank my wife and colleague Stacy, who I mentioned earlier, for her ideas and guidance and support over many years, both being college professors and teachers. We have a lot of, this is what we talk about a lot of the time. And Stacy, as many of you know, is an outstanding teacher herself, who, in my view, is highly deserving of this award at some point. And I also want to thank Sam Richards, who's here, because early on in my teaching career, I was an awful teacher. I was stiff, I was rigid, I read from notes, but it was not so interesting, I don't think. And at that time, I wanted to learn how to teach, and I started asking around. This is back in 1999. Who are the good teachers? You know, who should I go look at? And everybody pointed me to Sam, and watching him teach showed me two things. One, it showed me that you can't learn to teach by imitating somebody, right? Because I couldn't imitate Sam. But I did see somebody in their own zone teaching in a way that really matched who they were and what they were about. And that's the lesson I took from Sam, and I brought that into my own teaching. So I want to thank him since he's here. Finally, I could never put together any of these ideas on my own, so I want to end by expressing profound gratitude toward my students who've taught me all I know about how to teach them. So thank you. And I'm happy to take questions if anybody has them. Sir.
So I'm going to ask the question that I don't believe I've ever asked of you, and I'm sure that everybody here is wondering at some level, maybe it's not their first question. What's the most difficult topic of all the topics you cover? And you listed just some. Which one is the most difficult for you to cover? And I'll let you define difficult.
Well, where I go right away in answer to that question is the most difficult moment for me as a teacher. So I mentioned that one of the topics I teach is adult-child sexual contact. What I didn't mention was that when the Sandusky scandal hit, which I believe the news broke on a Saturday evening, at that point, my students had a homework assignment in anticipation of the adult-child sexual contact unit. And remember, it's about taking multiple perspectives. And the question was, imagine you're a more or less normal, well-functioning member of society, and you suddenly are troubled by the fact that you are feeling sexual attraction toward children. The question was, what are you going to do? Where are you going to go for help? And what do you think the consequences might be? Okay, so that question goes up on Thursday. The scandal hits on Saturday. Class is on Tuesday. Okay, and it's pandemonium. Consulting with several colleagues, the message, the advice to people who I think were trying to protect me was, you can't teach that topic now, not this week. I mean, there's just do anything else, but don't do that. There's a media shark feed going on, and what will be your soundbite to explain why you're doing this this week that would exonerate you in any way? So I did what all great men do in moments like this. I waffled, and I decided, I can't do this, and I canceled the class. I sent an email out to the students. We're given the nature of events, blah, 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 this unit is canceled, we'll be replacing it. Did that about 3:30 in the afternoon. Before I got to my car, 4 p.m., so probably less than a half hour later, I felt awful. I felt like I was copping out. And like if part of the problem here was silence, or that we weren't talking about things, what have I just done? And I got in my car, went back home, got on my email and said, changed my mind, class is on. I added a second question for students who found that question too disturbing given the, what was going on. And that teaching that week, that topic, taking the multiple points of view, bringing in the social science research was one of the most intense and profound weeks of my entire career. Honestly, it felt important. The students were interested. They seemed grateful to have a way of a forum to talk about this stuff, a way to interpret what was going on, and that was an important week for me. And Stacy said to me later, she goes, during the year, yeah, you're okay, but you're a regular teacher, but boy, you glow in the dark, like when things got really dark, I mean, I'm showing up, I have elephants, I've got, naturalist, I've got all these tools to bring to that situation. And so, that's a moment that seemed very intense. And I realize you're asking which topic in general is the most difficult. I'm not sure about that, because they all have something. I think I've chosen them because they all have something for me that's difficult. They all have some way in which they bring me out of my comfort zone, and to talk about them in front of people is a challenge, and it's a challenge that I want to bring. So I'd have to think more about that. I'm not sure about it. Are there other questions? Yeah, Alan.
Since you started with Dostoevsky, of course, I started to think about Crime and Punishment. So I was wondering, is there a way that somebody not in your area can do what you do using what they have? Because it seems to me if you read Crime and Punishment, you have a lot of this. Or am I wrong?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's what makes the book great, is that it brings you into the different perspectives, including that of the criminal. I do think this is a general approach. I don't think it's uniquely sociological. In fact, sometimes I worry my colleagues will only catch this part of what I do and not realize that students have a concept list a mile long and that we have sociological theories, and there's content as well. But for me, this stuff is important because it's important to them. In other words, this is how I try to prepare for the sociological explorations that we'll do, and it turns out that that preparation is what they find useful. But I'd imagine it's general, or the thinking of this as being for or against and aiming for that space in the middle. I don't know. It's I could use it. I was using it this morning with two faculty. We have beefing about something and trying to not take sides and get to the middle and try and learn the different perspectives. It's a living thing for me. I think it's very general.
I don't know if you get those kinds of students, but what do you do with the crime of indifference in your classes, if that happens?
Yeah, well, with the topics that I use, indifference has not been a problem. More of a problem, my concern is usually more that I'm going to offend somebody. And I did have, there was a moment last fall that was one of the scariest moments of my teaching career, and this is where I'm going now with this answer, where I showed up to class to find protesters at the front of the room carrying signs, and standing. They weren't from the class, and so I walk in. The students are walking in. It's very confusing. There's 6 protesters with signs. All the signs say things about how rape culture is bad, and denouncing rape, and then calling me a misogynistic, rape culture denying Penn State professor. Right? This is only a year ago, and then there was a Twitter storm going on about this because they started tweeting and people started retweeting, and so I worry about those moments where I have been misunderstood. So in case you're wondering, with the protesters in the front of the room, first of all, I read their signs as people were filing in, and I reassured them that I agree with what's on their sign. There must be a misunderstanding. They claimed that a student in the class, they had heard, it was a game of telephone, they had taken something that I said in class, and then it got spread around. I gave them the microphone at the beginning of class, and I said, well, you're here, the students are confused, why don't you tell them why you're here? And they did a little of that, then they left. But the thing that happened there was it became an object lesson for us all, because the students were jeering at the protesters. They became very protective of me, right? Because the students, they get my shtick and they know what we're about. This is 2/3 of the way through the semester. And so they're not sympathetic at all to these protesters. The protesters were kind of shocked by that. And the protesters began screaming, literally yelling at the students, you're part of the problem, and it got very, very, very heated. So when the protesters left, we had a lesson about the protesters as the deviant and what might be their points of view. And then after that, I put the word out to the protesters that I was going to be at a room for 90 minutes. We were going to have Lori Mulvey from World in Conversation facilitate a conversation between me and the protesters and anybody from the class who wanted to come. Had no idea if they would show up. We showed up, about, 5, 6 students from the class. The 6 protesters all showed up. And we had an amazing 90-minute long exchange about what happened, about our different views, about rape culture. There was crying, there was laughing. I mean, it was a really, really powerful moment of coming together and trying to understand each other's perspectives, which we then brought back to the class and got to talk a little bit about that. So I do worry, but I should just go back and say that when I saw the protesters there, I suddenly realized how vulnerable I am talking about extreme topics. And I worried that, okay, so is the collegian next, rape, misogynist, rape culture denying Penn State professor, and then what happens if it's the CDT, and what sound bites will I possibly be able to formulate that can, make a difference? And so I worry more about that than I do about indifference, honestly. Some days I wish for indifference.
I may be one of the few non-liberal arts here. I'm from meteorology, and I talk about climate change a lot, but now I realize how boring and mundane that is compared to most of your topics. As you talked about the differing perspectives, your work reminded me a lot of what Dan Kahan does, and how the more data that somebody gives often just reinforces their pre-existing notions. And I was wondering if you cared to comment on
Yeah.
that and how you try to work to overcome that issue.
Yeah, well, the first way is just to name it, and, call it what it is. Confirmation bias is what they call that, and that's our tendency to selectively expose ourselves to information that agrees with our views, right? And so and we're all very capable of that. We can select which newspapers we read and watch on TV and who we talk to and all of this. And so the way that it appears in my class is in that way. And then with the goal of attempting to do something different. So I find just naming it and becoming aware of it. Many people have not, especially young people, aren't even aware that this is a thing, that confirmation bias is a thing. Once you become aware of it, then you can think, oh, wait a minute. What if I did read or look at or examine some other point of view? And again, I attempt to model that in the class and design my assignments that lead people to look at things from the various points of view. So that's as good as I got. Okay. One more?
I'm going to go back to a variation of the question that I posed. And I think that given your answer, a couple things, maybe the answer is no. But the question is there any subject matter, any topic that you just refuse to touch?
Talking about adult-child sexual contact during the week of the Sandusky scandal was probably my test. And so I don't know. It hasn't shown up yet.
Well, let me say, just from the outside, it says a lot about your ability to teach, to really teach. Teach with a capital T, in such an environment, where you're touching these kinds of topics. Because as somebody who does walk up against them, and it's not climate change, but in the right environment, you're in a dangerous field.
That's true too.
But it says something, I think, very powerful. That number one, that you still have a job, right? And that you've been promoted and so on and so forth, because you're touching things that are so hot, so hot, with a population of students that just really so often refuse to hear that middle ground or hear something new. I'm quite amazed and impressed.
Well, I should add that I go through times of despair about it, and that I do question whether it's worth doing. I could teach it a lot more safely, right? And so Stacy hears a lot about this. I just want to teach intro. Just give me a textbook, and that's just in some ways that would be so much easier. But something in me would probably start to take it somewhere else. So I'm not sure what that is, but I do despair over it sometimes, and the irony is that each time I think, this time I could get fired. A few weeks later I get promoted, so I don't know what the message is there, but it hasn't crashed and burned yet. But I do worry about it, and I do often think about, maybe you just do this for a little bit and then you go do something else. Yes.
There must be times when you have conflict within the classroom, but from the students, where they take very different points of view and get angry. And there must be times when I assume some of these students have points of view that you find difficult. So how do you manage that conflict among them?
Yeah, I'm thinking, I haven't had moments where students are arguing with each other or fighting with each other. And I think it might be because we spend so much time on this perspective stuff early on I mean, I think it's true. If you're going to talk about difficult, controversial, provocative topics, you got to set the stage for them. And we spend a lot of time setting the stage and creating this awareness, which ends up creating an almost sacred space in the room for talking about things, because whatever's said, it's a point of view, it's a perspective that rather than argue with, we can be curious about. And so when those moments come, it's a, kind of a jujitsu move or something, but when those moments come, it's to remind them about the perspective. And I pepper all the time the slides about the elephant, about the naturalistic approach, and my own perspective and perspective. They're just kind of popping up, periodically to keep the spell, right? To keep the spell. And so maybe that's why, but I don't have that problem. It's not like the Maury Povich show or something where people are running around hitting each other. Yeah, Jack.
Could you talk a little bit more about where the naturalistic perspective ends and advocacy begins? I'm just thinking in particular, I teach a course in the rhetoric of the civil rights movement, and one of the texts in the class was George Wallace's inaugural address, the Segregation Now, Segregation Forever speech. And in the course of trying to understand his argument, I felt like the students were saying, yeah, I can understand where this guy's coming from. This sounds pretty good. And in fact, a lot of it did sort of resonate with certain political perspectives that are now current. And so I just thought, gee, what's coming out of here? Have I, given credibility? Have I helped to advocate for a position when I was really trying to help them to understand it?
Right. No, you got your finger right on something that is a difficult thing, because what happens is the more you understand something, if it was something you initially did reject, fear, or judge, it seems like the less inclined you become to do that, to have those feelings. I think what helps me there is that you want to do this from many different perspectives. You don't want to just end with one. And so, but ultimately, we have to function in the world. We're going to be forced to take sides on things. We got to vote and, things like that. And I think the idea is to first do the work, the disciplined work of attempting to understand before having that, taking that side or taking that position. So I'm not concerned that students are going to take a position about anything that I'm teaching. I figure they're all in process, and hopefully they'll continue this work, and maybe they'll have a different position at another point. But maybe right now, this is the one that, whoa, I never saw it that way before, and that's cool to me right now. I'm perfectly happy with that, assuming that this is an ongoing thing for them and for all of us. Yeah.
So let me follow up on that. You're assuming that development will continue, but if it doesn't, aren't we left with just relativism that any perspective is as good as any other one?
Well, all right. This gets philosophical, I think, and I mean that in a good way, because when I think there are many positions. Right, Chris? It's in a good way. Yeah, I didn't mean that as a derogatory term. Right, so there are many perspectives. We know that, and they exist in the world. They're out there, and I think by practicing adopting those perspectives, our own perspective enlarges. It widens. I don't know I lose the words here. It deepens. It becomes more than what it was. And so I don't have a position on whether everything is relative. I know that the more I try and understand from different perspectives, the more aware I feel about what's going on. And I think when it comes to solving practical problems in the world, that awareness is key.
Right. I don't mean I'm right, but you're an experienced thinker.
Okay.
But if your course is the only opportunity the students have to engage in this kind of openness and understanding without, moving in sort of the direction that I think Jack was talking about at later points, I mean, it seems to me that it's potentially, I won't say dangerous, but a problem.
Right. And what do you think the danger is?
The danger is that you end up with a kind of relativistic stance that, I understand this position, and and I understand this position, I understand this position, but I'm not going to make a judgment.
Right. I think that before you make a judgment, I mean, I think.
Yeah, certainly
Right.
I understand that.
Okay.
Yeah, you want to make a sound judgment.
Yeah, and I
right?
think we're
But you want to
also-
make a judgment, it
Yeah.
seems to me.
I think we're also in the business of judging. I mean, that's really the world we live in. That's our entertainment. How many shows now end with judges at the end pronouncing something or other? I don't know when that happened, but now that seems to be entertainment, is judging. The idea that there is a space or a moment where we can suspend that in order to learn, I'm not worried about that taking over because I feel like the world is so tilted against that. I'm more concerned to have it happen for, again, even 30 seconds in a semester I feel like is a goal. Thank you.
So, yes, Eric, thank you. That's been great. And if other people have questions, please, I'm sure Eric would be
Yes,
happy to talk to
absolutely.
anyone. This has been very enlightening for me, and I hope for everyone else. Thank you a lot for coming. And
Thank you all. Thank you.